Hold on.
Okay.
Sorry.
And we're on the air now. While Sherry is getting a pen.
Sorry.
And we're here now for our next live chat with our guest speaker today, Sherry Skalko. And I'm not going to do any more introductions of Sherry than that. I'm going to let her do the introduction. And I guess I'll start with, tell us a little bit about yourself, Sherry, and what the Institute for Nonprofit News is, which is where you work.
Okay, so Sherry Skalko. First of all, thank you for inviting me. This is, I really enjoy doing this. So I am the director of Amplify News Project at the Institute of Nonprofit News. So the INN, which can be found at inn.org, is a nonprofit, essentially membership association organization, and we provide support for nonprofit news startups and then also mature organizations as well. And we help them with things like fundraising tactics and audience development as well, right? Business, it kind of like runs the gamut. So what I do, the Amplify started, last July. It's a pilot program designed to raise the visibility of the work that's produced by our members in the Midwest. So INN right now has about 150 members, which was a huge increase during the last quarter of last year. So we grew from about 100, 120 up to 150 during the second half of last year. There's about 25 newsrooms that are from the Midwest that are engaged in Amplify. And so what we do is look at it from, it's three buckets. So content sharing. Are there stories that are being produced locally, regionally, that other organizations in the region will be interested in, such as issues about agriculture, Great Lakes, things like that, that are relevant beyond borders. And then also collaborations and distributions. So these are organizations that might not necessarily have the contacts, the bandwidth to reach out to larger organizations to create these relationships. And instead, I do that with the weight and the gravitas of all of our members to be able to go to somebody and say, hey, we can connect you with all of these newsrooms and improve your coverage of what's going on in the Midwest. So that's about the essence of it. And I got here, so I'm like, I'm like 25 years, 30 years into my career, I guess. Started off as answering high school phones part-time at the Providence Journal, became a reporter, became an editor, and jumped onto online in the mid-late 90s, and have since been working for either regional organizations like the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, and also for ESPN, AOL's Patch, which isn't owned by AOL anymore, where I was the Midwest editorial director. So I've kind of like run the gamut from local news, regional, and national, all digitally.
So full disclosure, Sherry was my boss when I worked for Patch. And both of us came to an involuntary end in that position.
But we met when we were both affiliated with the Online News Association.
Exactly.
Right? We were on the board, and I was just coming on. So
exactly.
It's been a while.
So let's talk about that idea that you were just discussing with the Amplify project, and you were talking about connecting newsmakers with news producers and leveraging the strength of the entire organization to help. Are you able to talk about a specific example that we could understand, or is that proprietary?
No, it's not proprietary. We're in our infancy with some of the phases, right? So the first one was really focusing on sharing. And so we would have, for example, MinnPost wrote a story about how the pharmaceutical pollution in the Great Lakes, which is a fancy way of saying all the fish are on Prozac. So we noticed that story on MinnPost, and we basically sent it out to all of our organizations that either cover the Great Lakes, cover environment, or are in that area. And we said, hey, is this something that you'd like to republish? And many of them did pick it up. So now that increases MinnPost's reach, and it helps the organization kind of fill their editorial calendar. So they're always looking at it, they're scrutinizing it, saying, does this fit our audience or not? So it was a great way. That's a good example of when we talk about sharing.
And
But when you,
MintPost is a nonprofit news organization based where exactly?
I'm sorry, MinPost
Yeah.
is in Minneapolis.
Okay.
Yep, and they cover
Kathleen.
a lot.
Hi, Kathleen. Thank you for joining us. We'll get to have you ask some questions in a little bit, okay? So go ahead.
So that's what we focused on first, was really understanding how each newsroom interacted with each other, right? Was there an appetite? Was there an interest? Really understanding as well the kind of news that they were producing. And so now we've got a really good grip on that. I just hired an audience development specialist, somebody who helps me. So now I've got a little bit more time to be able to cultivate the relationships, right? So we're looking at larger partners that would distribute our content. For example, right now, we have in Iowa and Wisconsin and Michigan, our members have relationships with the newspaper organizations there, so they push out their content locally. But folks in Michigan who may write a story about a Great Lakes issue, they don't have the contacts in Wisconsin. And so these are like distribution channels that we're trying to set up as well through larger organizations. And so it also helps too. So like we get calls from whether it's the New York Times, the Guardian, Huffington Post, and rather than having them contact 150 individual newsrooms, they contact me. I focus on the Midwest, but those are just my guardrails. I still go outside when there's other opportunities.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there an example of that where the New York Times or the Huffington Post might have contacted you, and what would they be looking for?
That's an excellent question. So we have yet to launch a project with them that would originate through Amplify. But one of the most recent collaborations that the New York Times did with an INN member was with Injustice Watch, that I worked with the Injustice Watch team on timing, on content, on how they wanted to approach the relationship. And, so it's a valuable resource to them because some of our organizations don't have a robust business development team or a partnership team. And so what they did was a story that Injustice Watch had been doing based out of Kansas City on, I'm going to forget his name, on somebody who had been exonerated because it was shown that the prosecutor and the police had an inappropriate relationship, and it also extended into the judgeship as well. So after he was exonerated, then the New York Times, where he was released, the New York Times basically did an infographic that showed like how was this gentleman supposed to be getting a fair shake when all of these things happened.
Got it. Why is it really important for these nonprofit news organizations to have these distribution channels beyond their own channel? I mean, they have their own platforms, right? So why is it important to go beyond that?
One of them is, I think you can look back to the 2016 political season. So Amplify was conceived before them. The idea had been hatched prior to that. But the 2016 political season really underscored the fact that a majority of news organizations are based on the East Coast, and there was really an underrepresentation of news coverage in Midwestern states. So these nonprofit newsrooms really have their, essentially their hands on the pulse, their fingers on the pulse of what's going on in their communities, unlike any regional or national organization would. So some examples end up being like Wisconsin Watch did a really in-depth investigation on how immigration policies would affect dairy farming. And that's something that they have these relationships already. and are able to tell that story in a way that others can't. Right. So, and then you've got Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting, which is based out of Champaign, Illinois, really focuses on agriculture and big ag. And specifically, you know, they cover Monsanto and related ag issues. So you'll have other organizations doing a story on dicamba, for example, which is the pesticide that is actually resulting in damage to non-GMO crops, or I should say, crops that are not designed to withstand dicamba. Yes, a larger organization can come in and do that story based upon 2, 3 people, organizations that they speak with, but Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting has been covering this since its inception all the way through. So the depth and breadth and context that they're able to give really is a more robust story that can be told. And also, one of the differences between that gets to the whole nonprofit versus commercial is our organizations really track their impact. So they track reach. Can they get to as many people as possible? And then impact. Are they affecting change? So it's not necessarily their goal to affect change, but that's how they know, are we making a difference and are we living up to our mission? And so the more people that read their content, the larger the opportunity is for them to basically be part of the conversation or affect the conversation.
Sure.
Shape the conversation.
And what comes to mind as you're talking about this is, it's like, so there's a wrecking ball going through the general interest newspaper industry. It's been going through that industry for more than a decade now. And these newspaper organizations don't have the resources anymore to go to cover the range of beats that they used to cover in the depth that they used to cover them.
Yes.
And so what it seems like we see is a lot of smaller, in many cases nonprofit news organizations popping up who say, look, I can't cover everything, but I can cover the hell out of this.
Yes.
And so that's what I'm going to do. And this might be the Great Lakes. This might be agriculture. This might be San Diego.
Yes.
So it could be geographic, or it could be subject matter oriented.
Correct.
And so what I kind of hear you saying is that phenomenon is ongoing and continuing to grow. And so it's sort of like a symbiotic relationship between those organizations and more general interest publishers who can say, I have an audience that would be interested in this, but I don't have the resources to cover it.
Yes.
You have the resources to cover it, but you don't have the reach to get the story out there.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Well, I do want to pause. No, go ahead.
Yeah, and that's what it is. So, so for example, right, we've got, so East Lansing Info covers the 19,000 people in East Lansing, Michigan, who do not attend, that are the permanent residents there, right? And that is all they cover, because nobody else just covers them. Right. And so they are hyper focused on their hyper local mission, right? And so then we have the Energy News Network that will cover energy, alternative energy issues throughout the Midwest. And you'll take, for example, they'll do a story about Minnesota's first electric powered school bus that MinPost is like, they cover, that's their beat, but hey, they just got a story from a friend of theirs that they can put in there. So now Energy News Network gets more reach, and MinPost now has coverage on something that they don't have to expend their time with, right? And there's lots of other examples too that we will look at things like, there'll be a school superintendent, like for example, a school superintendent in one of our markets. They our news organization did a profile, our member did a profile on him. We can look at his background and see where he's from and where he went to school and say, let us do this for you and go push it out in a different part of the country. And even if it just the link gets pushed out on social, it's still expanding the reach of what they're doing.
So I've got another question related to this, but while I'm asking that, Kathleen, if you have a question after that, give me a thumbs up, okay? And we'll go to you, all right? So my question is, this is a business of journalism, business of communication.
Yeah.
Does this reach that these nonprofits get, is this important because it helps support their business model?
Yes.
And if so, in what way? Can you kind of connect the dots for us?
Yes. So let's take the verticals, because the verticals are a little easier, right?
What do you mean by the vertical?
Topics,
okay,
subject-based. So you have environment and criminal justice and agriculture and things like that.
As
so
geographic or horizontal. Yeah, okay.
Exactly. So we help. It's essentially in a perfect world. Their financing comes from two ways, right? It's either donations, either one-off donations or a subscription type based model, like a membership model, or through foundation work. And so if we can get, look at ProPublica, right, is a really good example. So ProPublica writes a story, but it's just ProPublica. If they're writing a story about something that's going on in Des Moines, and their content is published in the Des Moines Register and 4 other papers in the area, they've satisfied their funder needs or funder requests or expectations, right? They can say, we're pushing our content out to the people who need to see it. And then at the same time, that relationship drives traffic back to their site, right? In a perfect world. Now, when it's in print, you don't get a lot of traffic back. But when it starts being shared, now you're turning this audience into email newsletter subscribers. You turn them into email newsletter subscribers. Now you've got an opportunity to turn them into donors, right? And so that's kind of what you want to do. So it's almost, you introduce marketing into it. It's a lot of it's branding. It's like, oh, hi, I'm in Wisconsin, but I also know that Midwest Center for Investigative Reporting covers agriculture issues, and I'm interested in that. So now they go to that site, and now they're seeing more ag content that they're interested in. So it's really, it's marketing and promotion. A lot of it is in order to, essentially bring readers into the funnel. So you'll hear that in marketing talk a lot. You bring them into the funnel, you engage them, and then convert them.
Mm-hmm. So. Kathleen, you got anything you got to take yourself off of mute.
I know what this is like.
Okay, can you hear me?
We got you. Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of heard you say earlier that reach has been your issue lately. How have you been going about trying to expand your reach right now?
Excellent question. So it depends on our members, right? So I work within a centralized news association, and we have members, and I work with our members. And so what we do with them is help train them on things like email newsletter and growing subscriber lists, and social media and growing reach through there, and also through partnerships and through distribution. So the more they can get their name out there, when people do come to their site, are they ready to capture them in email and then engage them and convert them? When they're on social, are they, again, when people click on their content on social, are they ready to capture them? And are they running, it really comes down to digital marketing campaigns too. And that's one of the interesting aspects of this, is that it's not just, oh, if I push out my content, more people are going to see it, more people are going to see it. There's a saying of, don't build your house on rented land. right? Social media is rented land, because then Facebook comes along, changes their algorithm, and all that great traffic that you were getting from Facebook, you don't get anymore. But if you're constantly working to convert those social media users into email subscribers, now that's your audience. And if you can start building a relationship that way, then now you're in charge of working and building that connection with them. But then there's also distributed models. We have some organizations that are that really focus on investigations in a locale, right, in a geographic area. And rather than worrying about putting together a traditional audience development plan, they will strike relationships with local television stations, local newspapers, and things like that, and say, we will provide you content in return for you paying for it. So that's how they're building they've got basically a revenue model, essentially earned revenue versus donations.
Okay. Real quick on top of that, because I did have written down, if you're picking up the slack for local news, because I know you did mention earlier, Kurt, that, a lot of the local newspapers are cutting a lot of employees. And so on that, are they willing to pay? Are like larger papers paying for this content? And if they are, how is that different than hiring like a local news reporter to cover it?
Yeah, so it depends on the relationship and it depends on the organization. But yes, they will pay that amount. They will pay for, some do pay for content, but other nonprofits aren't necessarily interested because it's just not their goal. We always encourage, yes, try to get either money or metrics in return, right? You need something, and it's either going to be the people coming to your site or financial compensation, essentially. And then what was the second part of your question? Because it was brilliant and I forgot it.
It was, how is that different than them,
yes,
paying for?
Because the amount of money that they are paying for individual investigations ends up being lower than that they would pay for a head count.
Right, because the news organization that's buying a story from a nonprofit news organization is not subscribing to an ongoing thing. It's a one-off. They're buying this package of stories and then moving along.
Yep. That being said, we do have an Investigative Post, which is based out of Buffalo, does have an ongoing relationship with a news station whose mission is investigative journalism. And so their primary reporter from Investigative Post is on air all the time. And so they do have a good relationship, a very close relationship there. But I think a lot of what people, it's hard to know unless you've been a hiring manager or an HR person before, is you have a salary, but then you tack on X% over it to cover benefits, workers' comp insurance, et cetera, like all these other.
The whole bunch of overhead that goes with hiring a person.
Paying for their computer and everything like that. Yeah, so it
ends up their computer.
Yeah.
Paying for the coffee that they're going to be drinking.
Yes.
Although what news organization?
Their travel expenses. It's just, there's a lot of things that go into it.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer your questions, Kathleen? Or by all means, ask more.
Well, yeah, I kind of have one on back of that as well. So what's to stop newspapers from just cutting out the reporters altogether and just buying up content from sites like these?
Yeah, well, there aren't enough nonprofits right now to do that.
Oh,
right?
Okay.
And those newspapers wouldn't have a say in what gets covered, right? Mm-hmm. So those newspapers have their own audience, and the nonprofits have their own audience. And if anything, it would be the nonprofit being kind of like the bird riding the crocodile's back kind of thing across the swamp, right? For lack of a better imagery. I don't know why that's in my head right now, but And so they provide, those newspapers provide a platform for the nonprofits content, but by no means do they replace the day-to-day coverage. Because a lot of when we're talking like nonprofits who do investigative journalism, they're producing content, original content, once every week or two, 3, 4, depends on how large. ProPublica is large, so they produce it all the time. But the more local ones are producing it on a 4 to 6 week cycle sometimes.
So you both raised a question that I wanted to get to at some point, and now seems like as good a time as any. As we in our class are talking about the business of journalism and the business of communications and talking about business models, tell me about where you think nonprofit journalism is going, where it's headed. I mean, it's not exactly lighting the world of journalism on fire at this point, although you are seeing growth in your organization. Where do you see it going? I mean, is it a sustainable model? Is it something that's really viable?
Yes. So I would say that it's quietly lighting the world on fire, because you've got all of these cutbacks that are going on, and you've got journalists who are now out of work going, well, hold on a second, who's covering my community? Right? So there's still a need. And if anything that we've learned over the past, year, 2 years, is the need for information is even more vital now than it's probably ever been. And it's always, the challenge is always, okay, like you said, is it sustainable? I think that what we've realized is the ad market has become so fragmented, right? We don't need to buy ads on, when I say we, advertisers don't need to buy on regional news organizations because they have Google and Facebook and so many other ways to reach their audience now that it's not newspapers anymore. And it's certainly not newspaper websites. But people are now subscribing to newspapers, right? So again, after the 2016 election cycle, New York Times subscriptions went up, Washington Post subscriptions went up, and now a lot of news organizations and nonprofits are getting into I know people value our readers value what we're doing. Can we get them to pay for it? And they're starting to pay for it. So last year was the most money that was ever raised in nonprofit journalism. Over 200, based upon the data that we had, based upon INN members and other organizations that are affiliated with Newsmatch and funders and whatnot, 202,000 people donated $33 million to news organizations last year. And Newsmatch, which ran October, November, December of last year, where a group of foundations pooled money together and said, we will match up to X amount. I want to say it was $25,000, $28,000 per organization. And some blew it out of the water, and others that are smaller so needed that money because hey, we raised $10,000, now it's $20,000, and that in these small communities pays for 1 or 2 more reporters. So it enables them to grow as well. So my response is is there a sustainable model yet? Not yet, but all of the arrows are pointing in the right direction.
So do you see 150 members in INN who are nonprofit news organizations?
Yeah.
Are they all over the place in terms of their business models, or are there very, very clear, distinct commonalities in their business models?
Yeah, I think it falls into, there's only so many ways to support yourself, right? So there are commonalities, right? There's a range. When you say there's all over the place, there's a finite amount of ways, right? So you'll have ones that are purely foundation based, or they focus on their content studios where they push their content out. They're not too concerned about direct traffic. And then there's others who are direct traffic and focus really on not just foundation, but subscriber or local support. So it all depends. And what everybody is trying to do is, okay, how can we increase earned revenue? And as I mentioned before, is the membership model is the one that I think more folks are starting to gravitate to. And, you know, and it all depends too. There's some that are like part of a board that have funders who are like, we're funding this. There's a foundation who will just continually give.
Mm-hmm.
So
when you say foundations, you're saying these news organizations, these nonprofit news organizations will write a grant to a foundation and say, or grant request and say, this is what I'm interested in covering. This is why, this is how much I need. Will you support me? And then they may get grant funding for that from a foundation.
Yeah, and there's different types of foundations. So like you'll have a larger one like Knight and Democracy Fund and MacArthur and McCormick, the large ones that you see, and that is the traditional grant process. But then there's also family foundations that are like, we are going to fund this news organization because we believe in it and it aligns with what we're trying to do. And so it's like that. And or they have donors where they just traditionally receive donations from that particular family.
Okay. And then one of the other models you talked about is the donation model, the subscriber, sort of like the National Public Radio model. We're having is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, it's always ends up being at the end of the year, everybody does their giving, their drives, right? And when I say, put it this way, nobody really survives just on foundation funding, because the foundations want to see you moving forward and being sustainable as well. And there are still other foundations that will fund topic journalism. Like, okay, your education this education content is underwritten by this particular organization, and so it ends up being like kind of like a quilt that a news organization will put together to piece together funding. But at that same time, some foundations are be like, okay, this is just for this long, and we expect you to be at this particular point. It's almost like this is for a boost over the wall. So everybody wants to eventually get to the point where you've got foundation and individual donations and earned revenue.
And earned revenue meaning we're producing a product, you're paying us for it. Meaning here's content, would you like to buy it? Okay.
Television station, we will do this for you for X amount of dollars. Yes.
And then another thing that we talked with Kristen Hare last week about from Pointer was events. Does that play much of a role, and can you talk about that?
Yes, it does. So Texas Tribune does a lot of events, and there's other organizations, and they're known for it. And a lot of other organizations have, they're starting to do that as well. So it ends up being part of that mix.
Okay. And how would an event typically work?
Oh, that's a good question.
Is this outside your wheelhouse?
No, it's not. It's just so I'll just take an example, right? If you are an organization that covers criminal justice in Chicago, right? It's you may decide, okay, we are going to bring in these 3 experts, one from the University of Chicago, one from, this author, this particular expert, and another, a third person, right? So you get a nice mix of sources, right? Of people that you would normally go to that lend a certain level of expertise or point of view. And then you would charge for admission and say, okay, and then your proceeds go towards supporting this organization.
Or you might have sponsors who want to be associated.
Or you might have sponsors, exactly. So you get sponsors who underwrite it, awesome. And then when people are there, you basically say, this is possible, but through a grant from these folks. And oh, by the way, please consider donating to us because, you know, it helps us make these possible.
So one of the things that we've been talking about that in this particular unit that we just started is, I don't know, you may remember that the last time we talked about this, I think I brought up the Riptide report, the oral history of sort of the downfall of newspapers and the rise of digital media and whatnot.
Yeah.
And one of the topics that came up in there is whether or not it was a grievous sort of original sin by the newspaper industry to not charge for its content when everybody went online.
Yeah.
One of our students, Juwan, wants to know your thoughts about whether or not we should have and should we be doing it now. And by the way, that Sherry has the credentials to talk about this because she's worked in online journalism and print journalism for her entire career, in sports, in general news.
Yeah.
So
one of the things, and I apologize, I'm trying to get my my adapter because I'm starting to run out of battery. So pardon me as I'm thinking over my answer is, looking in the rearview mirror is too easy, right? I'm sorry. Yes, we should have charged for online content, but who knew, right? So it's an experiment. Like it was, hey, let's do this. And because at the time, the number of people who were online were small and they were still getting a lot of money from paper advertising. And so nobody at the time back, you know, let's say 1996, nobody knew, oh, if we do this 20 years down the road, we're going to be, you know, digging our own graves. So in that regard, I don't begrudge experimentation. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. There we go.
While Sherry plugs in her computer.
Okay. So it's experimentation, right? It's just so happens that you're experimenting with an entire industry and an entire technology revolution. Should we be doing it now? Yes. But here's the challenge, is because you need a quality product to essentially deliver to somebody, and it makes you work even harder. And so therein lies the challenge. It's like it is, yeah, now all of a sudden newspapers or news organizations are faced with a business. And so it's paramount that they make decisions that are closely aligned to their business goals, right? And that includes editorial decisions, right? It's like you cover things based upon who wants to read them. And that's difficult for some folks to digest, but that's the way it is. My father said to me when I was starting out and I was at the Providence Journal, gosh, 1992, 3. And he's like, do you know what your job is? And I'm like, to cover men's and women's college hockey. And he's like, no, do you know what your job is? And I'm like, to put out the paper every day. He's like, no, do you know what your job is? And I'm like, to sell newspapers. As a reporter, your job is to sell newspapers. And you do that by writing the best story that you can in a way that is interesting to your audience. It's like you need to engage with your audience, and digital allows you to do that, and it gives you the real-time feedback. So in that way, the revolution was a good thing. And I just think that there's more news organizations are like figuring that out just now in some ways.
I think what the point you're making is a point that actually Juwan and I exchanged ideas about in an email exchange, which is, yeah, it better be a damn good product, and it better be something that I can't get anywhere else.
Yes. Yes.
Because if you're just going to charge me, if you're going to try to charge me to tell me what the city council did last night, that's just not going to cut it, you know, because I can find that out myself.
Well,
there's other news sources where I can find that out.
Are there other news sources? That's the thing, right? In East Lansing, Michigan, nobody else is covering their school committee meetings, or
maybe that's not the right example, but I'm talking about the idea that there's 3 news stations here, all with websites. There's an alternative weekly publication. There's a daily regional newspaper, and you're right, they're not necessarily covering Chesterfield City Council.
Yeah.
But 90% of what's in there on their websites is a commodity that I can get anywhere.
So you will pay $5 a month to a hyper local website that delivers you traffic updates and the city council report and the school committee report and what's going on with your property taxes and your towns and your pension payments to your police force, et cetera, right? Because you're not going to get that anywhere else.
Right.
So let's look at regional newspapers, because this is interesting. I am a subscriber to the New York Times and the Washington Post because they cover national.
Because they're killing the game right now.
They're killing it. Yeah. Right. But nobody else is doing it, right? Because the LA Times and the Chicago Tribune and the Dallas Morning News and all of these newspapers that used to have foreign bureaus and used to have national bureaus all cut back. So the only way I can get decent foreign and national coverage is through those 2 organizations. The Chicago Tribune, which is behind a paywall now, right? You get a limited number of clicks before you have to pay, or there's some content that they put behind and some that they don't. The content that I really want to read, there isn't enough of it because they are so spread out. I don't care what's going on in Orland Park. I don't care what's going on in Schaumburg. I care what's going on in my city, that they don't cover my neighborhood. They will cover City Hall, but like you said, there's so many other organizations covering Chicago City Hall that it kind of devalues what they're delivering. So I have yet to be a subscriber to the Chicago Tribune.
Right.
And Sun-Times is free. So
yeah, there you go. So Liz is asking, sort of in a follow-up here. No, sorry, this is a question from Brooke. Your opinion here. What's a more sustainable model? Earning money through ads or the paywall?
I would say the most sustainable model is delivering value. And then however you attach to it, because the whole ad thing is, it ends up, it's are you getting businesses to pay for you or getting your readers to pay? Those are the 2, right? Because display ads, a lot of people are, that's going by the way of the Edsel. I think subscribers. I mean, I think it's a combination. I don't think it's going to be one or the other all the time. But it hurts me when I see some of these local news sites and they look like NASCARs.
Oh God.
And I love them. I mean, I know the editors and I get it. I totally get it. But oh my God.
Yeah.
There's got to be a better way to make your user experience better. Because it's not just the content you're delivering. It's when I go to your site, can I read what's going on, or am I disrupted all the time?
So this is a question from Liz. Can you talk about how INN makes money?
Excellent question. So we have a few ways. So we're very donor driven, and actually you can go to our site we're super transparent, and that's a requirement for membership as well, is we show where all of our donors come from. So foundations, so the traditional ones, as is my project. So my project is grant funded. We do get individual donations, and that's not as much because we're an association, right? So we're not producing the journalism. So the individual contributions aren't what you'd see at a actual news organization. Membership dues. And we have what's called INN Labs, which are a brilliant group of developers who not only serve as technology and product developers for our members, so our members can get a discounted rate by using them. Anybody outside of membership can use them at a standard rate. And then also they produce publishing WordPress plugins. So they contribute back to the ecosystem. But that's a revenue source as well.
Okay. Kathleen, I'm going to go ahead and ask another question too, but I want to make sure that I give you another, since you're representing the students. We want to make sure you get some more chances to ask some questions, but I'll go ahead and ask, like, we may have covered some of this, but I mean, what do you hear from the nonprofit publishers about their biggest challenges? What are the things that keep them up at night?
Well, it's never a lack of stories to tell. It's not enough hours in the day, right? And because a lot of it is they're small operations. Some of them are smaller operations. And it's always like, how do we find enough hours in a day to put the business side work in? And it's tough. A lot of them know, what needs to be done and how to do it, but don't necessarily have the time to execute it. But again, that's where INN support is coming in. So that's what we're seeing as as an opportunity to say, okay, we will provide this for you. Instead of hiring an audience development person, Amplify will do this for you for, that kind of thing. So it gets into what we were saying before. You don't necessarily have the money to hire a full-time person, but there can be a centralized resource. And so that's what we see is, like, we're doing this for a group of nonprofit news organizations because it just makes sense. To why should they be investing in something that is kind of like not uniform across the board, but it's a common skill set.
And the word you've mentioned a couple of times is audience development. And that's one of the key areas where INN works with these publishers to help them in their audience development strategies.
Well, I mean, because that's the beginning of a business plan. I mean, a lot of folks are just like, they'll be like, oh, okay, I want to start a website. Okay, well, for who? It's not what are you covering? Because they're like, oh, I want to cover, but well, who are you covering it for? Who are you covering it for? How big is that audience? And how are you going to reach them? So imagine you have a product. Imagine you have this invention. Well, who is going to buy it? How many of those people are out there? And how are you going to reach them? It's the same thing. Like, I've got a widget. That's how I would do my business plan.
Students, take a particular note as you watch this video of this section right now, because you're going to have to address these questions in the business plan that you're going to come up with.
Yeah.
Those three things are?
Who is your audience? Who are you doing this for? How many of them are there? What is the market size? And then how are you going to reach them? That is your audience strategy.
Right.
So where do they live? In between there is like, okay, where do they live? And when I say live, is it in real life? Is it an email that you're going to get to them? Is it social? Where do they live? Are they on Instagram? Are they on Facebook? And then what is your strategy for reaching them?
And that's what you're talking about with audience development, the strategy for reaching them. And that includes things like email, social media. Go on.
Yep. And then we take it a step further, right? So we help support our organizations in guiding them through that process. And then we take a step further in saying we will establish these relationships for distribution and for sharing and for collaboration and things like that to elevate the coverage of these communities so more people can read it. And it's a better informed public too. I mean, I know we don't want another election where we get to the outcome and all of a sudden everybody's scratching their head and said, what happened in Michigan? Well, the bridge can tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't a surprise to anybody who lives there.
Kathleen, do you have any questions?
I do have a question about the business plan that
Yes.
you had to write. Is that something like that you take when you, I mean, after you had the idea, you wrote the business plan and then you took that to your investors for this?
I individually know, but that's what news organizations should do. And I've done it at every news organization that I've been at, right? So it's not my role now because the association is up and running. But for example, when I was at a B2B publication, our goal was like, okay, who's our audience? We were risk managers. Risk managers were our audience. Yes, we had ancillary or adjacencies of other people who were sold insurance to them, but it was risk managers. Well, where do they live? Well, they sure don't live on Facebook because that's not a place where people talk about insurance, but they're on LinkedIn. And what do they value most? In real life interaction with peers. So we would reach them through events because we'd get them in a room and engage with them that way. Does that make sense? So it's a business plan that goes with it. It's everything. You need to know the target that you're shooting at rather than just putting an arrow in your bow and just shooting around.
Any follow-up, Kathleen? Or are you good?
I keep getting my questions answered.
Great.
Okay. It's one of the challenges, like, so I'm going to take that a step further. That's one of the challenges that regional news organizations have because their audience is so fragmented that it's really difficult to come up with a comprehensive audience development plan for a retiree who lives in a suburb, for a millennial who lives in an urban setting, people of different backgrounds and cultures. And I mean, pick it. If you're, there's got to be somewhere like, okay, we're just shooting for 50-year-old white males. No offense, Kurt. But it's almost like that. And then it's like, oh, we need to reach millennials. So let's do a weekly spinoff that takes everything that was in that newspaper and dresses it up and uses like the cool language that the kids are using these days. And we're going to pass it off as a millennial thing. And we'll do polls and it's going to be a lot of image driven and stuff like that. And it falls flat because it's not genuine. So it's just a way to capture them without actually giving them what they want. So it has to be something of value.
So I have a question about the Amplify project, and let's talk about it in terms of INN as a whole too.
Sure.
Are there plans to expand the project beyond the geographic area that you're in, or expand INN's reach?
I hope so, because I like my job.
And the other piece of her question was about student-run publications. Are they involved?
Okay, let's do the first part first. Is yes. So the thing about Amplify is you can't start. You have to start somewhere, and it's better to start small and make mistakes and figure it out than it is to start big and say, I'm going to do this. So what we're really doing right now is we're piloting, we're experimenting. The 25 members who are engaged are awesomely patient and they appreciate it. And I appreciate it. I mean, and we're learning things that we're going, okay, this is something that can go beyond. So I'll come up with something that I'm like, oh, this is going to be great for Amplify members. And I'm like, but it's not restricted because it's not geocentric. So it doesn't have to be just Midwest. And I'll be like, you know what, let's do this as an INN-wide project kind of thing, right? So yes, we would love to have Amplify grow. But right now we're really focused on our learnings and our discoveries and then scaling it, right? So we don't want to just go, yes. It's like, okay, we did this. What does it look like if it gets bigger? How many resources would we need to continue it? And how do we make it sustainable? Then student organizations. We focus on nonprofits. So many student organizations are supported by their university or other means. And so they need to have nonprofit status in order to do that. So we do get inquiries, and we get lots of inquiries and we've gotten a lot lately. So that's why when you're like, it hasn't taken it by storm, I'm like, you're not in some of my colleagues' inboxes, because they get a lot of inquiries.
Great. That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
You mentioned making time to do the business side of the work. That's one of the things that keeps people in nonprofit news organizations awake.
Yeah.
Jean Dubail was in our classroom a few weeks ago.
Lucky you guys.
And he talked about how, we all talked about how a generation ago the business side was not something that we gave a damn about.
No.
Talk about the difference. Talk about, is that still different in nonprofit news organizations versus for-profit? Should it be? What's your perspective on all that?
So I was the managing editor of the Chicago Reporter for a year, and all of our reporters wanted to know who was funding, who was getting, like, did we land another grant? Because they're like, they know, like, in order for us to keep going, we need to get another grant. Oh, we're getting a new website because somebody, whoever it was at the time, granted us that money to do so. And so I think this day and age, and by the way, the enrollment in journalism schools has not gone down. So, and a lot of journalism schools are now teaching audience and business classes along with it. And so today, and especially when you see like the people next to you being laid off, you tend to become more engaged in the business side of things and understanding what's going on. There is always, as a reporter and as a journalist, the constant kind of self-check of, am I crossing that line, right? Am I maintaining journalism ethics? It's always good to know what's going on, but what you do with that information is what's key, if that makes sense. Is that what Gene said? What'd Gene say?
Yeah, he said about the same thing. Yeah. I mean, we just can't afford not to pay attention anymore, and we need to understand how the business works. And frankly, nobody really understands how the business works, because the business is changing.
Yep.
And we're all trying to figure out how it works. And, we know how it used to work, and we know we need to adapt, but we're all trying to figure out how we're adapting and how it's going to change.
Yep.
And I don't think it's going to be as simple as it used to be, because one day, 25, 35 years ago, you had two choices to get your news. Now you have many choices and many different flavors. So
and so that's right. And that's also having a newsroom that is the right size for your audience, right? And it ends up, that's the key. So you look at an organization like the Marshall Report or the Trace, and they cover specific verticals, and that you don't need a large team to do that. But then you look at like ProPublica, which is growing, and then they went into Illinois. Illinois' team is smaller than New York's team, but ProPublica is a national. They're not niche. They're investigative, and they got it down. They're awesome.
Yep.
Sorry.
Well, we've come to the top of the hour, and I promised you that we'd be done in an hour. I thought maybe I'd give you a chance to just have the last word before we sign off. Anything you want to add?
Is like now I think now, in the times that we live in, there's no more important time to be a journalist, which is wonderful, because it has really, I think, it's done two things. It's challenged those who run journalism to think more creatively about building sustainable models. And I think the American public is starting to no longer take for granted the news that they receive, which is wonderful. And so it's a I mean, it's a great time. It's a great time to be alive. It's a great I think it's a great time to be a journalist, because there's a lot of important work out there, and there are people who are willing to pay for it.
That's great. Thank you very much. Kathleen,
Thank you.
thank you for making the time to be here. And Sherry, thank you very much. Really happy to have you here.
And thank you for having me again, Kurt. I always have a good time.
Great.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.